Okay, well that works. Hands filthy today, so got gloves, wrinkly gloves on. All right, this is the Beelink EQR6 6900HX with a very unusual amount of RAM. 24 gigabytes and 1 terabyte of storage. So Beelink is doing a very interesting cost saving measure here, going with 24 gigabytes of RAM, because most people don't really need 32 gigabytes of RAM. 16 gigabytes is starting to get a little bit tight, I guess, in some crazy extreme senses, but 16 gigabytes is still pretty good for people. 32 gigabytes is overkill for most people, so I guess it makes sense to go with 24 gigabytes. And it's using DDR5, which happens to come in that capacity. So this is their new boxing. It's pretty compact. It's a little bit less overkill than the previous versions that were for like their GTI Ultra and Sur 8. So this should be relatively easy to store. Keep your box for people that like their computers. You might need it if you have to ship it back, and it's also good if you decide to sell the computer, to sell it with the original box. So here's the specification. It's a 6900HX AMD Zen 3 processor with a 680M iGPU. It's pretty powerful and handy to have. Yeah. We'll take a quick look at it. What we got inside. Same old style of packaging, just different size. Ooh, cute. Okay. It's a little bit of foam on the inside there. We got thank you. That's nice. We have a hello card. Quick manual. See if there's anything important in there. It explains all the I/O. Gets USB-A, USB-C, 2 HDMI, dual gigabit Ethernet, and an internal power supply. Nothing too critical other than how to set it up. USB power supply settings. Default for the pen into 3. Oh. So you can wake this computer from sleep. That's interesting. With that pin setup. And we can take a look at the actual box. It's plastic, so there's no aluminum here. What do we got here? We got a nice color matching HDMI cable, and here's the power cable. No brick, because the power supply is inside the box. And for how small this is, I was expecting it to be a lot bigger for having an internal power supply. Beelink is doing something really marvelous stuff here, taking advantage of GAN power supplies to make their power supplies smaller, and then just including them inside their machine somehow. Now, the actual power supply capacity isn't huge. I'm used to seeing these 6900HX mini PCs with 120 watts or 150 watts. And this unit has a very unusual, I think it's 85 watts. It's very small. And I'm wondering, how in the world is it going to power a USB 4 port with such a small power supply? 85 watts is barely enough to even power the 6900HX. So I'm going to have to test that out. We have a very similar design to the previous Sur 8 and GTI 14 Ultra. I'm just going to save this packaging for later, but that's weird. Here, I'm going to pull out the Beelink Sur 8 Put it right beside it. It's a very similar size. You see that it's a little bit larger, a little bit more rounded edges. It's a little bit taller as well. That's a good way of looking at that. It's very similar height, just like a fraction of a millimeter taller. But it's the same concept, where there's a large central fan that pulls air up and through the bottom, and then exhausts it out the rear. The Sur 8 has a larger fan, definitely. I guess some people are a bit more curious how the Sur 6 Max, Sur 6 6900HX compares in size, side by side. And this is going to be the closest competitor. This one has a more conventional, pulls in air through the side vents and has a secondary fan through the bottom to help cool the machine. Very, very similar size. It might almost be identical, except for a fraction of a millimeter in height to the previous Sur 6. And then, of course, there's the GTI 14 Ultra for another size comparison. This thing's just huge because you really do need as much cooling as you can possibly get when trying to cool a 185H Intel processor. Core 9 Ultra, whatever the Intel i9s and Ultra 9s, they are very hot. And it's very large, it's much thicker, and has a larger internal power supply. I think about, what was it, 145 watts. So, all right, that's sort of a look. And Beelink is really leaning hard into this pulls air in through the bottom with a single large fan. And we'll have to test it out, see how that affects the airflow. Dual gigabit Ethernet. I'm not sure how happy I'm with that. It's definitely a cost-saving measure. Dual Ethernet is useful for niche like server and connecting to other computers uses or redundancy. But I'm seeing a lot more computers with 2.5 gigabit mbit Ethernet. So this is unusual. And there's no rear USB 4 port. There's no rear audio jack port. It's very, very basic. You have 3 USB-A ports, 2 HDMI 2.0 ports. These are limited to 4K 60 Hertz. And there isn't really anything special up front either. This is a USB-C 3 port, limited to, I think, 10 gigabytes per second. So no 40 gigabit per second bandwidth. USB-A, you got your audio jack, standard power button. Beelink has been doing very well, including these pull tabs. So it helps with removing the cover, but also, as before with the Sur 8 and GTI 14 Ultra, they've been covering their screw ports. You can fish those out with a pair of tweezers. And I'm going to test this computer out before disassembling it to see what's inside. Now, what am I kidding? I still got time. I'll take a quick peek look inside, because one of the weird things Beelink told me when they first sent this unit over was that it was going to have LP DDR5. I don't know if that was a miscommunication or maybe I imagined things, but the new sales listings for this model report that it's using standard Sodimm modules. That's a massive win because I love the modularity of those modules. You can upgrade them as much as 64 gigabytes of RAM. That's a lot of RAM for the future. So you can start off with a very, very healthy amount of 24 gigabytes of RAM and then later upgrade it. I think that's a great way of adding life to a computer. All right, we're gonna go with PH1 bit. Always put down a sufficient amount of downward force when opening the device, and this shouldn't affect the performance of the machine because this is standard operation. You should be able to open the computer, see what's inside, change the RAM and SSD as you need. Okay, screws out. Pull that pull tab and it comes right out. You don't have to use any pry bar or something to lift the lid out. That pull tab is great. I'm glad that's included. And here we see the inside. Ooh. Okay, so what do we have? We've got DDR5 Sodimm 5600 megahertz. Huh. Well, that's total overkill. This computer is limited to 4800 megahertz. So I don't know why Beelink included 5600 megahertz. Other than that, they just bought so many 5600 megahertz DIMMs. They're just using them in everything. But that's also great if you ever happen to upgrade to another machine. You can always just transfer this over if that machine has slower RAM. Ta-da! And here's the power supply. 4.47 amps. Yeah, 85 watts. That's a really, really small power supply. Directly connected over here. This is tiny. We're going to have to see how that runs in some tests. But can I get a good peek of what's under? It's really hard to see the fan that's on the other side without opening up this computer even further. There should be two M.2 ports underneath. And anything else of note? I'm wondering where the M.2 wireless card would be stored. So I'm going to open this lid here. This is a much simpler machine to open than the Beelink GTI 14 Ultra. I mean, I was taking apart, what, 16 screws just to access the SSD. Now I'm still also just a bit puzzled here. How am I supposed to open this? I can see one of the SSDs there. But, ew. Okay, I see what I'm doing. I need to remove this screw and possibly one more screw. Nope. This bit is too big. Don't use a PH1 for that. We're going down to pH0. Let's see, that's a much better fit. Okay, one more screw. Woo! I will see if there's an M.2 card in here. There we go. Nope. Okay. I don't know if you can see it here, but unfortunately, this is not going to be an easy computer to disassemble because this SSD is directly underneath this daughter board. So I'm going to go test this computer out, and then I'm going to go back and try opening this up. But I'm afraid that I'm probably going to have to unscrew 1, 2, 3, maybe 4 more screws. So this isn't as bad as the GTI 14 Ultra, but it's not exactly great. You have great and easy access to the RAM modules, but not the SSD without disassembling and removing this daughter board to take out this SSD heatsink. It's not exactly the best design, but baby steps. We still have a very impressive power supply here, and an otherwise very compact 6900HX mini PC. Like the other Sursex here, this was already a very packed mini PC. And somehow Beelink has managed to fit even more stuff inside. But also less I/O. So no USB 4. I think that's the biggest thing I'm disappointed about. So you can't do single monitor setups with this. Oh well, trade-offs. And we're going to test this out and see how this machine performs. All right. Yeah, everybody have a wonderful day. Bye.